back. We're holding towards the end of Perik Ches. The line begins Shlema right at the dot, the period Behini B'chinis Yichud Zeh Tshuva Zu. He B'chinis Tshuva Ilah, which is literally translated, this oneness and this tshuva is this supreme tshuva. Now, if you Shalachar Tshuva Tata, which comes subsequent to Tshuva Tata, the inferior tshuva. Tshuva Ilah would be the superior tshuva, Tshuva Tata, the inferior. So what is Yichud Zeh? What is this oneness, what we're talking about? So, as usual, we just mentioned that you can see this very past class, perhaps if you saw it and wherever you were watching it, but if you haven't, you could go back. It's just an easier access to the original website, tanyaonline.com. You have also the advantage that you have the text set up in a way that it's easy to follow the class. And all the previous classes of this Igeres HaTshuva, which is the third segment that we're learning in this Sefer Tanya Kadisha, the Holy Sefer Tanya. There are 5 segments we're holding in the center of the Igeres, this center segment called the letter, the presentation of Tshuva of the Alter Rebbe. You could see the one before, the class before. I believe this is the third class in the chapter 8, and you can see the entire Igeres HaTshuva. Mentioned also all the previous classes of the previous segments also lined up, and not only to note that we had merited to conclude it, it's namely that we periodically quote from the Igeres, namely from the first segment, which is Likutei Amarim. Generally, when you say Tanya, it's primarily Likutei Amarim we mention this time and again, and all this, of course, for newcomers, that you can see all the previous classes lined up on the left side of the class and opens left side of the site and opens up in the same fashion. So this very last week, we spoke about that unique union of the Yid with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In a way, that the Yid could reach such a degree that he's one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, similar to whether Hashem, the neshama is within Hashem, within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, prior to Hashem imbuing, blowing, vayipach b'apav nishmas chayim. But that itself is unique. The whole Perik Daled and Hey and Vav, starting from Perik Daled, it sets the tone of the difference between all the other creations and the Yid. Yid is a chelik havaya amay, solely the Yid. Everything else comes from everybody. Everything else, including angels, comes from Shem Elikim. So even when the Yid becomes a Metzias, as a separate entity, as Neshama is a separate entity, nonetheless, it comes from Vayipach, the inner blowing, the inner core of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But of course, deeper than that is the Neshama prior to Hashem blowing the Neshama into being, which then it's really one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We mentioned similarly the way it is lahavdil by a human being. When you blow, it's not like, you have like pockets of air which is just ready to be extracted, discharged. And every blow you're just taking from one sack of air, so to say, and you're giving it out. No, there's no shelves full with air bubbles that you're ready to just to bring out from the inside out. The oxygen, the breath that you blow prior to your blowing is really part of your nefesh. It's part of who you are. When you blow, it becomes an entity, becomes a metzias, which means it becomes an entity of a breath that eventually, that itself is always attributed to your inner core because it's coming from a deeper place than when someone talks. The difference between Dvar Hashem Shamayim Nasu and Chelik Havaya Amei, the Yid is associated with Yipach Ba'apav, Vayipach Ba'apav Nishmas Chai. But that's all again when it becomes an entity, how much more, an entity on its own, much more so, that same breath prior to your blowing, it's really part of your soul. It's not just like, it's not an entity just waiting to be extracted, but it's part of you, who you are, part of your soul. The Yid, prior to the Vayipach Ba'apav Nishmas Chai of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, was really part and parcel of HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. And that level of unity, a Yid can achieve through his tshuva, starting from the tshuva tata, that he's able to unite with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that unity in a way which is an unprecedented, unimaginable unity, is really part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He could lift himself up in a way that he alleviates himself, emancipates himself of anything which disturbed that cleave, that adherence with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and once he's emancipated from that, he becomes really part and parcel of the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Not only is an entity which is pure, but yet an entity in its own, pure and liberated from anything which would not have allow it to have that perfect symmetry with the on high, with the Yud Kei Vav, right? Tshuva, Toshav Hei, Toshav Hei. The Hey aligning with the Yud Kei Vav, and that pure symmetry with him as a Yid, which has the Chilek of Ayama, but beyond that, he's able to elevate himself to such a level of unity, like V'terem Nafshe Nafcha, in the way he were part and parcel of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, we're of course saying this briefly, in order to understand this, what we just said, presently said. So if you learned the class, it's a little review. If you were followed, it's a little review. One could understand this, but if it's something new, of course, it's a brief repeat and review. To see it, you ought to go back to just the previous class. I believe it's the second class in Perek Ches. We ended Perek Zayin we began in the same class. We began the 8th chapter. So this is the third or fourth. In either way, you just got to go back. It's one click away to see the energy of the information which we learned last week, the week before, and the whole spirit of this very chapter, chapter 8. So the Alter Rebbe points out in today's class, we're learning that it's not just like a sensation. Oh, I'm there. I'm really part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Alter Rebbe is telling you it's a particular avodah that you go on with, you perpetuate, and it's a unique type of avodah. You upgraded yourself to this avodah that you can sense that constant oneness. In other words, it's not like, oh, I'm there, it's a flash of a sensation, I'm one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and now let me just go back to the regular, even good regular of good stuff, learning Torah and doing this, all the stuff which a Yid does. But no, the Yid's upgraded, that is constant. He's able to establish that unique type of relationship on a constant. He's upgraded to an elite, so to say, type of relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's such an elite remains an elite. If you don't do something nonsensical to drop from that elite state in any area where your eliteness is represented, if you don't do something drastically foolish, you are constantly on that elite level. The Yid is able to elevate himself, and from now on, he is on a very different conveyor belt, as we call it. He is able to overtly maintain that oneness of the Kodesh Baruch Hu in that very fashion which we spoke about last week, which is on its own. It's precious, it's stupendous, the idea that the Yid could become one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the way he is in Neshama B'guf, not after, like the famous word of the famous Perek of the Alter Rebbe in Perek Yud Ches, namely Yud Tes, in Likutei Amorim, the first segment, a click away, the Alter Rebbe says that's the nature of the Neshama, wants to become part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So there it's L'mata L'mayla, post becoming a Metzias. So he's becoming, the inner desire of a Yid has become, even to lose his own entity, to become part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But here it's not necessarily the idea of the strive of the neshama. Here he's telling you that, yes, you alleviated yourself. As you went through the process of Chuvah, now there's no barrier. The sky, the expression, the sky is also not the limit. The sky is the limit. No, the sky is also not the limit, because you could end up the oneness is in a way that you're one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, similar to the way you were within HaKadosh Baruch Hu prior to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, infusing, in other words, blowing you as an entity, as a neshama. But that's, again, you're able to maintain that oneness throughout. How does a Yid maintain that oneness throughout? And here the Alter Rebbe introduces Yichud Zeh, Tshuva Zu. First of all, you should know this is the Tshuva law. Of course, this is something out of the ordinary. Totally out of the ordinary, understandably. And that's why we notice that it's not only correcting, which is the idea of the Tshuva Tata, and again, the whole idea of Tshuva Tata, you have to follow, namely from Perek Daled, Hey, Vav, Zayin, at the beginning of Ches. It'll be a long time to explain once again what the Tshuva Tata. But there you're dealing with the area where it could have been messy and you straighten that out. Tshuva Ilah is on the onset. It's kind of it's superior because it's an elite type of tshuva. If we understand it's not dealing with the area where the mess was or could have been, but you're dealing with a higher. Now, tshuva ilah, when you say tshuva ilah, you also have the idea of tashuv hey. Why is it called ilah? Because within the Yud Kei Vav Kei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the holy name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you also have the higher Hey. We have two Heys in the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Hey Tata and the Hey Lo, which means Yud Kei Vav Kei, the lower Hey and the higher Hey. So in the lower Hey, as Alter Rebbe explains in these very chapters, starting from Daled, that's where the Hey could have not only disaligned itself with the Yud Kei Vav, but Rahman and Slan be a source of energy to the forces which are antithetical to Elokus. And that, in other words, that's where the mess is, and the whole idea of Tshuva, that the person elevates himself and able to shake himself away, him or herself away from this whole unfortunate experience and realign the Hey with the Yud Kei Vav. That's Tshuva Tashuv Hey, returning the Hey. But then there is the Hey Ilah, returning that Hey from the Yud. Now, where did that Hey go? Apparently, that's really within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is the idea of Chochma Bina. Hey Tata, we explain, is the way the person expresses himself, is dibur, speech, right, or even blowing for that matter. But the way it comes from within to the outward. You talk to somebody, that's the first time that you cross the line from within yourself to another party. Till then, it's all in you. You're intellectualizing, you're emoting, even your emotions are associated with some party out of yourself. That's usually what the person is able to emote, is usually with something which is occurring out of him. So you see someone poor, vulnerable, you arouse a sensation of pity, compassion. It's all about the other part, but still it's all brewing within you till you go over to that party and says, you want to come in, I want to serve you a meal, I want to soothe you, I want to make it comfortable for you, and you give the person something to eat or lodging. That's where you're dealing with another party. That's the line that you're crossing from the way it's all happening within yourself to another party. And that's the difference of Yud Kei Vav, Chochma, Bina. We spoke about this so many times, and it's all around, it's spoken all around, all over rather. Tanya and any other place, Kabbalah, Tanya, Chassidus, wherever you know the Yud represents Chochma, Bina, the Hey is Bina, expansion. And again, in this very chapter, Dalit in Igeres HaTshuva, click away. And then the Vav is the Midos, the emotions, and then the Hey is already the Dibur Machshava, Dibur Mais, if you want to be specific, it's thought, speech, and action, but namely it's the speech, the way the person goes away from himself and deals with another party. If you think about it conceptually, we wouldn't have to talk if there wouldn't be another party. Sometimes the talking something out brings about a certain clarity in this, which you trying to understand and figure. Some things you verbalize, you utter it, it becomes a bit more clear. But generally, the whole idea of talking is when you're dealing with another party. Talking is that threshold where you go out from yourself into another dealing with something out of yourself. And so to the idea of blowing, it leaves your mitzvahs, leave you. So when you talk about the tshuva te'ilah with the Hey of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the whole Yud Kei of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is where the Eibishter forms himself by himself, within himself, and particularly when you're talking about Yud Kei even vis-a-vis the Vav. The Vav is the sixth Midas. Midas is also a person, the emotions are expressed within the person, but nonetheless, it's already dealing with a matter out of the person. Usually emote with things which are associated with this, which is occurring around you. It's the famous saying, and Chassidus explains, that even Rachamim Chasadim are so associated with Eilam. Of course, there's this simple meaning that your Rachamim, your compassion and your kindness is eternal, but there is Kimei Eilam, also a Shaykhus to Eilam, not only Malchuscha, Malchus Kol Eilamim Dibur, we spoke about this so many times, is the source of all Eilamas, but even Even your emotions are associated, subtly associated with Eilam, even though they're not dealing yet with Eilam. It's the Hey, which is the Dibur dealing with Eilam. It's the Malchus Makavi Malchus Kalilamim. But nonetheless, the way we see it, by a human being, that your emotions are associated with everything around you. Take that example we gave from the poor, the destitute, the vulnerable. You rouse a certain compassion, it's something out of you, but it's still, the workings are still within you. It has that duality. It's within your system. You didn't say a word to the other party yet, but it's dealing with something out of your system. Yud-K is when a person wants to think and understand and intellectualize in a particular manner. You seclude yourself. The idea, the way yourself, for yourself, by yourself, in a way that it's in nothing to do with another party. To the contrary, another party disturbs in a way when you want to understand something. You're studying for a test, you take your books and you close yourself in a room, remove yourself from others because you're trying to utilize your cognitive faculties in a way, in other words, to get the best out of them, to perceive and understand the material that you're trying to absorb. So you remove yourself because Chach Yudke, even in vis-a-vis the Vav, is also the way you for yourself, by yourself. The expression of these faculties of wisdom and understanding, we mentioned many times, the difference of wisdom and understanding, the difference of Chachma Bina. You can see it clearly in Perek Gimel of Lukuti Amorim, the first segment, also just a click away. It's a Chachma, the flash, as opposed to Bina. That's why it's a full hay, it's expansive. It's the same thought when it comes into expansiveness and expression and elaboration. That's the idea of Bina. So one thing is clear: the Yud-K is very much the Hashem, the way Hashem is for Himself by Himself, and that's reflective in the neshama. So when we say tshuva ilah, is the idea of the celebration of the Hey and the Yud, because you're dealing with the tshuva toshav Hey. So it's not only celebrating the Bina, which is the Alter Rebbe is going to say that's constantly learning Torah out of love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's that elite state of tshuva. And the reason why we say the Hey, returning to the Yud, because in the end of the day, where do you see the true Nekuda of Bittul, the true Nekuda of that oneness with HaKadosh Baruch Hu? The Echad HaEmes is in the Yud, in the Chochmah, even more than the Bina, because Bina is somewhat a Metzias. It's about the concept being expanded on. Is Alter Rebbe the famous Perek Lamed Hey in Lukuti Amarim Kasher Shamaiti Mimayri, the famous Ha'ora of the Alter Rebbe. At the Echad HaEmes is in Chochmah, because Chochmah is in Nekuda. That's why the Yud is the smallest letter in the whole Aleph Beis, because it represents the nothingness in vis-a-vis, in the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It feels the senses, it identifies the grandorness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore it's no Metzias. Therefore it represents and reflects the Echad HaEmes, the kind of pretty much slap in the middle of Perek Lamed Hey in Lukuti Amorim, Kasher Shamaiti Mimayri. That the Echad Chochmah represents the Echad HaEmes, because Bittul is a keli for the Echad HaEmes. The nothingness is a keli, is a representation of the emes, of the truth, recognizing that the emes is in a lukus, hence everything else remains small, minute, and even a nekuda ktana, as it says, the kutzushal yud of the Eis Yud, on top of the fact that the Yud is the smallest letter, because it's all about, in the end of the day, Bittul. And that's why the Chochmah is so much closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yamusu v'lei b'Chochmah, the Alter Rebbe has the famous word in the 18th chapter, in Lukuti Amorim, again, just a click away. Then anything Misa, even a subtle Misa is kind of not appreciating the Emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's somewhat some type of a Misa of death, devoid of the Emes, Hashem Elikim Emes, Hu Elikim Chaim, Elikus is life. V'loi b'Chochmah, that doesn't exist in Chochmah, because Chochmah is Bittul. Bittul is the keli to the Echad, to the Emes, to the oneness, to the truth, and to the core of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Becomes a keli, becomes a utensil. It becomes a recipient, the perfect recipient to be associated with, be associated with the Echad Emes, with the oneness of HaKadosh, with the truth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is a darg of Chochmah. As you can find it in Nigla, the famous Seita, Gemara Seita, Daf Heyamid Aleph. And in Yuchelim Loder, when there's bittul, that's when there's a lakus. And the famous Ameir, even Shmini, because when the person is, that's when there is when there is, even subtly, when there is you're closing the door on a lakus. Because true bittul, that's where that becomes the container, the vessel, to continue to appreciate the emes Hashem. That's why Chachma Zechad Emes. So even the Hey, which is about expansiveness in appreciating Elokus, in matters of Elokus, again, the difference of Yud Kei, the Chachma is the flash of the appreciation of Elokus, like again, repeating the tidbits from the Peri Gimel in Likutei Amorim, not to go into it now. The Chachma is, that's why it's the Nikud of Emes. It's not a Metzias, it's a little bit of Bina takes that very Emes and expands on it and elaborates on it. That's what Bina is all about. Nikuda Beichala doesn't lose the energy of the Chachma, the Nikuda, and it's Beichala in the chamber means it becomes in a state of, it enters into a state which is able to expand, which that's the idea of Bina, understanding something thoroughly. You break it apart and you elaborate on the idea, and you don't lose the energy of the Chachma, but nonetheless, Bina is still an expansion. It's within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's still Bina in the face of even Midas, the Vav, how much more so the Hey, which is the Dibur, the way they just like it's laughable by the human being, it's the step stool where the person leaves himself to deal with others, you talk to others, and the Vav is still within yourself, the Midas is within yourself. How much more so, as we said before, the experience of in intellectualizing is all about the person ways for himself, by himself, and so too with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The whole Yud is really the core, the inner workings of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is similar to the Neshama prior to the Neshama. Synonymous. This is the message. Prior to the Neshama coming as a Metzias, which that only happens at the Hey Tata level. That's when the Neshama emerges from the Yud Kei Vav Kei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, emerges from the Hey Tata, and it becomes a Metzias. And here we're talking about, as we explained in last week's class, the Yid is able to elevate himself, emancipate himself from anything which disturbs his ability to connect with a full level of oneness with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And to what degree is a person able to reach the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu is for himself, by himself, in a way that you become part of the Kaviyach, the Nefesh of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because when before which that happens on the level of Malchus, means it becomes a Metzias of a breath on the level of Heitata, but the person is able to elevate himself to within HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Terem Shenafcha, the way the Neshama is prior to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's blowing Vayipach, which means you become part and parcel of the Nefesh of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that would that be Dafka in the Yud Kei, because the Yud Kei is the way they wish to taka for himself by himself. We can select it for himself by himself, like we say the difference even of Vav vis-a-vis the Yud Kei, as we just explained. Because the Vav, the Midas are all transpiring and happening within your system, but it's all about the other party. It's when you're around the other parties, that's when your Midas, your emotions come into function. This way, that way, compassion, kindness, severity, and so on. But the Yud Kei is the way like it is Begash means physically, but the human being is the way you stand in seclusion of connection to others, and to the contrary, the others can disturb, as we just gave the example. So to L'Havdil HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Yud Kei of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is again reflected in the Neshama, when Neshama is a full Chilek Havaya Amei, as the full Yud Kei Vav Kei set up within himself. That's who the Yid is. So when you talk about the Yud Kei of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's the real Pnimius of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is the level of B'terem Shenavcha Beruach Miruach Piv. That's the way the Eibush just forms himself by himself, and that's the area of the Neshama prior to Hashem blowing the Neshama and establishing Neshama as an existing entity. How does it reflect within the Yid's Aveda, and even prior to that? But and he says even the Bina is elevated to the Yud. Toshuv Hey, because the Bina somewhat, and again, let's try to understand it. Bina is expansion. That's why Bina does not reflect the Echad HaEmes as much as Chochmah. As the Alter Rebbe has it in the famous chapter Yud Ches, also towards the end of Yud Ches, the last page of Yud Ches, second page of Yud Ches. It's the Chochmah of the Nefesh which has that that opening, that window into the Ein Sof, into HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because of its bittul, because of its being not. That's why it's the keli to the greatest yes, which is again the Echad Emes, the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's a yud of Chochmah. That is Echad Emes. Chochmah reflects Echad Emes because of its bittul, so therefore it's a keli, a vessel to the greatest, to the Emes, which is a Emes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So even when it comes into Bina, it's taking that same energy of Chochmah and expanding on it. You're not losing. Again, when you're losing sight of the Chochmah, you're not going the right direction. Even when you maintain, like the Lashon of Chassidus, Nekuda Behechala, the Nekuda you were able to maintain in the chamber, in other words, in that expansiveness of Bina. And one needs Bina, as we explained even in that Peri Gimel of Kuti Amarim, a click away, that you need the Bina because in the end of the day you want to make it real to you. So even though one way or another, because where there's expansiveness, you're losing the purity of Chochmah to a certain degree, you're trying to maintain, and you're able to maintain the oneness of Chochmah in that Bina, Nekuda Behechala, but nonetheless, by definition of Bina, expansiveness is as important, as virtuous, and as great, and as significant, and as essential as it is. Nonetheless, it's about expansiveness. And expansiveness to some degree, subtly, even it's an expansiveness of this very energy of Chochmah, but subtly it's somewhat doesn't maintain that same bittul of Chochmah, of the Nekuda, of the Yud. It's already, there's Ispashtos, there's the Hey. And just like in the other side of the spectrum, when there is Ispashtos, it's a contradiction of the connection of that oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but that's expansiveness and Ispashtos in one's true egoistic self. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about subtly, even Bina, the holy Bina associated with expansiveness of matters of Elokus, which of course it's a keli to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course it's connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But nonetheless, expansiveness is different than that bittul and the kud of bittul, and it compromises one way or another on the kud of bittul. So when you're talking about the true oneness of the neshama's true unity, true oneness with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the way Hashem is for Himself, by Himself, illustrated in the previous class, b'terem shenaf nafcha miruach mipiv. Prior, as the Yid is part of the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even the Hey is part of the experience of the Yud. Now, how does it reflect in Avodas Hashem? So before this, so of course it's the idea of the Yid filling his mind and appreciating deeply matters of Elokus, intellectualizing, in other words, profoundly meditating and connecting on the level of Chochmah Bina on matters of Elokus. But beyond that, and together with that, is the idea of constantly learning Torah, mitech simcha rabba, with great joy. Your life is associated with Torah. You're a Torah Yid, and you're learning Torah with love and fear of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, again, because the Yud, K, Yud, and K, also, you could see in Peri Gimel, L'Kutei Amorim, towards the beginning of L'Kutei Amorim, a click away, that eventually it produces the Midas, which is, by the Neshama, it's the Av B'Yirah Chesed and Gvura, representing love and fear of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Yid learning Torah with love and fear, learning Torah with great joy. He becomes, this is the way the Yid becomes the elite Yid, connecting, in other words, that constancy in that oneness on a constant basis, that it's not just a flash of ecstasy, oh, I became one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I was able to emancipate myself from anything which was disturbing my neshama to elevate itself because of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and now I got there, and that's it, so let's say, l'chaim, and let's move on. Even with good stuff. He says, no, because Limud Torah is also associated with your, of course, your cognitive faculties, understanding Torah, appreciating Torah, involving oneself in Torah, and understanding Torah, not trying to put, of course, their own pshat in Torah. It's the idea to understand this is Chochmasei Ubinasei Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ki Chochmas Chama Binasei Minu Amen. Torah is the Chochma Bina of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Torah is this level of Yud Kivav, Yud K. So besides, again, it's the same. It's similar. It's utilizing your cognitive faculties of understanding and appreciating, meditating in matters of Elokus, but together with that, and is the constant being the Torah Yid, constantly learning Torah with great joy and great elation and in great enthusiasm, and ultimately with love and fear of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is the experience in Avodas Hashem of experiencing that oneness with HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the level which we spoke about the last week, which we just mentioned, B'terem Shenaf Ropi, becoming one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu's nefesh, because that's what the Yud K is all about. And then we see it, Alter Rebbe is going to point out so beautifully that even in the word Bina, which is about the Hey, you have the idea of Chachma as well. Because if you look at the word Bina, it's Ben Yud K. Bina, Beis, Yud, Nun, Hey, it's Ben Yud K. The Bina itself says that it's about me becoming one with Chachma, even though the Bina itself is about the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as we explain the difference of, again, by the human being, lahavdil, that utilizing and investing and putting into motion their cognitive faculties is when they remove themselves from the rest, remove themselves from the secluding themselves, which is again the way the person is truly formed himself by himself, as we just explained. Even vis-a-vis emotion, it's also within the system of the person, but it's dealing with the outside. Yud K, but within that, and so too, this is the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu formed himself by himself. But nonetheless, the Bina is somewhat of a spashtus, even on matters of elokus, and how much more so when you're dealing with Torah. That Torah, you have to understand everything. You have to love and davar metich davar. You can't just learn and say, I'm batal HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm just going to look at the Gemara and hopefully some flashes of elokus, which is in essence in every single letter, word, in the whole entire Torah, maybe Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh and beyond. In other words, beyond the Gemara and the Rishonim and Achreinim and so on. Kol mashim matal v'devasik asad l'chad shekel nitna mebeisha b'sina. Everything, Torah, if it's true Talmud, of course, not chas v'shalom, those who, so to say, manipulate their way in translating the Torah they want to. But we're talking about Talmud Vasik. That's what the emphasis is, a proper Talmud, someone with a true Yiddur Shamayim. And he's Mechadish and Torah also carries the energy of Anechi Hashem Lekecha. How much more so when a person opens a Gemara, of course, they have all the energy of Anechi Hashem Lekecha in this piece of Gemara, and you say, well, I'll do it on the Chachma level. I don't want to expand, I don't want to understand this thoroughly. No, that's not the way you learn Torah. You learn Torah, you have to understand every piece of Gemara, and every Rashi, and every thesis, and it ought to shine. If words don't make sense, no, you didn't understand it, because the moment you understand it, you'll see that in every word of this Rashi makes sense. And you have to put in your Bina, you have to put in your... But nonetheless, you're talking about Bina, understanding, appreciating the Torah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Anechi Hashem Lekecha. And even you always understand that the Bina itself is Ben Yud K, that the Hey itself is really a conduit, it's really carrying, and it's really carrying the energy, and as such, always connected to the Yud, which is the true Bittul, the true oneness of the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As again explained in so many areas of Chassidus in general, how Yud is the Echad HaEmes because of its bittul, because of its smallness, translated in the true grandness, being the container of the Echad HaEmes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the true oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is precise in Chachma, even vis-a-vis Bina. So when the Bina, the Yid learns Torah, and he always remembers that it's Torah Hashem, he always maintains that Chachma, that Nekuda, and that the Echad HaEmes, which you're dealing with the Elokus which exists in Torah. But how does it translate in Avodah? That your mind is invested in appreciating intellectually matters of Elokus on the level of Bina, but connected, starting from Chokhmah, extending itself to Bina, but nonetheless, always in the Nekuda B'Chala, Bina itself, Ben Yud Kei. Together with that, you're constantly, a Yid's constantly learning Torah. He becomes a Torah, the elite. He becomes a Torah because he's now within HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. B'terem shenafropi, which is the Yud Kei, and even the Yud Kei, the way it expresses the Yud, which is the true oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the way the Eibishter is on the core essential energy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's how this oneness is expressed in the Yid Aved Hashem on a constant, perpetual basis, not just a flash of excitement and a sentiment of I reached there and now let's go on. No, it's an avodah which comes after Tshuvat which was explained in the previous chapters. The Yid reaches the Tshuva law. Like it says in Zeir HaKodesh, Holy Zeir Rai Mehemna, which is the part of Zeir called the Rai Mehemna. For that matter, that's the part that says that it's associated with Moshe Rabbeinu's writing, and the one who wrote the Rai Mehemna was the Nefesh of Moshe. Came into that writing again, not for now, of course. Parshas Nasei. That what does he say? What is Tshuva law? That you're learning, you're involved. No, not only learning Torah. What is your asik? What is your occupation? Is learning Torah. With fear and love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is the vav, which usually comes as a result of Yud-Kei, like the Rebbe writes again in Peri Gimel. In L'Kutei Amorim, as you can see, there's a click away that through the Yud-Kei, through the Chochmah Bina, which is called the Ava'im, you have the Telis, the offsprings, which starts from Chesed Gvura, represented by Ava and Yira. He starts over here, Yira and Ava, fear, which is awe and love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Yu Ben Yud-Kei Bina, this is Bina, Bina itself has the word Ben Yud-Kei. So today just concludes this chapter. This is where we're going to leave off this week, but again, we're not concluding, we're not landing yet, because we have this brackets, all of 3 lines, is something extremely important, because Al Rebbe is telling us over here. So what? Tzaddikim can't have this experience. Someone who Chman Islam never sinned and doesn't. Ein tzaddik ba'aretz asher yaseh teva la'yechta. It says everybody has their iniquities somewhat. You live in Elam Haza, and it says clearly. But the idea that someone who's namely a tzaddik, of course, he could also serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this manner. And look around, true tzaddikim, their mind and heart is learning Torah a whole day. Whenever they have a chance, they live Torah. A real tzaddik lives Torah. Tzaddik which turned over the whole entire world and brought elukus and saved the generation and all generations for all times, the greatest tzaddik of all times, and metamorphosed an entire world, introduced Torah and Yiddishkeit to every corner of the world, like no one, unprecedented in this manner. What was his life? His life was Torah. His life was Torah. That's why it says by Mashiach, when it comes to the Rambam, Eisik b'Torah keDavid David. Then it comes that he's Yilchem Milchemes Hashem, v'Yinatzech. But of course, Milchemes Hashem is not through the actual Milchama as a war means to say that he fight v'Yichazik Bitka, and then he establishes v'Yokov Kol Yisrael. This is words of the Rambam written almost 1,000 years ago, illustrating who Mashiach is. That he is somebody who is mechazik bedek of all Kol Yisrael. Kol Yisrael is not a particular neighborhood. The simple meaning of Kol Yisrael is Kol Yisrael. We could put our eyes in the sand and say, yeah, maybe this is Kol Yisrael. No, Kol Yisrael is Kol Yisrael around the globe, and he is Yaakov Kol Yisrael. He is mechazik bitka, and he is miyilechem milchemes Hashem. But how does it start? Who is Mashiach? Says the Rambam. That Eisik b'Torah keDavid Aviv. That his whole occupation, again, Asik, not only learns Torah, his Asik, his occupation, his business, so to say, his Asik, like you say, a businessman, that's what he does, and that's what his mind and passion, it's all there in what? When you say Asik b'Torah, in Torah. That's what Mashiach is. Ki David David, like we said about David, famous Gemaras about David's learning Torah. And he selaz v'leish, as it says the Gemara, in Brachas, when David HaMelech would wake up, and David HaMelech's dialogue with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, David HaMelech was Torah. Says David HaMelech, the big warrior, David HaMelech, which conquered and established the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu for perpetuity. David Melech Yisrael Chai B'Kayim. His whole Metzius was Torah. So you find that by tzaddikim, because that's where Yid is. The Yid primarily is all Asik, is learning Torah, Metech Simcha, Rabba, like the Lashon of Al Rebbe later, with great joy and elation, because that's his life, that's his Asik. And it was Al Rebbe over here, from the Zayr, but with fear and love, that's what a Yid. And that's what a tzaddik is. So what is it? So why over here in Yigash Tshuva? In other words, what's the advantage of the Baal Tshuva reaching this level of Heilah? The tzaddik could also reach this Heilah, maintaining that oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu on the level of Yud-Kei, Bina, constantly appreciating Elukus and constantly learning Torah, a Torah Yid. The Rebbe says you should know the Baal Tshuva. The Baal Tshuva has a notch over the tzaddik in all areas of Beitas Hashem, including in this area as well. And therefore, it's associated with Tshuva Ilah, which comes after tshuva tata, associated with the Baal Tshuva, because there's always an advantage in the Baal Tshuva. Again, the famous Gemara, Makom Baal Tshuva Eimim Tzadikim Gemara Meinachem Lambi. A place that Baal Tshuva stands, even the great and righteous Tzadikim cannot stand there, because the Baal Tshuva has a special connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as we see evidently. Where he says a bracha, he davens, where he's always maintains that passion and sensation, which the tzaddik doesn't experience on a constant basis, and as default by Baal Tshuva something. The default of the Baal Tshuva is something great, and like the Rebbe has in Perek Zayin, in L'Kutei Amorim also click away. The difference of somebody who's always next to water. Yeah, you always appreciate the water. You always appreciate a good cup of water when you're thirsty, but you're around the water, so your appreciation is limited. But if you're away from water, you're in a desert. Eretz Tzia V'Oyev B'Limoy, like the Lashon of David HaMelech in Tehillim. That a person is away from water, he's in a desert and he's thirsty. His passion to water, to Mayim Chaim, is something which is indescribable. No comparison to someone who's hanging around water. And that is the passion of the Baal Tshuva. And the passion of Baal Tshuva is threaded through his entire Avodas Hashem. Everything he does, and everything the Baal Tshuva he or she does is about a line with that spirit of passion which exists precisely in the personality and the Avodah of the Baal Tshuva. And so to over here he says, even in this area of the Yud Kei Bina, which he explains over here, is also always a notch over, like it says in Zeir HaKodesh, in the Holy Zeir, Parshas Chayesara, in the Parshas Chayeparach of Chayesara, in other words, the Zeir on the Parsha of Chayesara, the Inun, Moshchin, Alayah, Berusid, Libe, Yatir, they draw upon themselves with greater ambition, with greater desire, greater motivation of the heart, Yatir even more, Ubechela Sagi, Liskarvela Malka, with greater passion to become close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, etc., which is the end of Perek Ches. This is the default life of the Baal Tshuva. So if the Baal Tshuva learns Torah, and the Baal Tshuva davens, and the Baal Tshuva does a mitzvah, everything about the Baal Tshuva is always a notch over, because by him is always that sensation of the tzomah l'chanafshi, the yearning, the pining to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and everything they do. And so too over here, even though the tzaddik also has a shaykhus, not only has a shaykhus, tzaddik lives the best Yud Kei Bina. Tzaddik lives Torah, and everything about the tzaddik is about that oneness with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but nonetheless, Baal Tshuva and everything about the Baal Tshuva. And so too in this Aveda of Tshuva Ilah, there's a notch over, because by Baal Tshuva, there's always that extra excitement, extra passion, extra sensation in their Avodas Hashem. And as such, this tshuva of the hey, Ilah, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is also in the tshuva, because the real deal of this expression is dafka by the Baal Tshuva. And with this we conclude Perek Ches, definitely a loaded chapter, small chapter, but indeed a loaded chapter. Perspective, and elevates the Yid to this new level, so to say, emancipation and liberation of anything which didn't allow them to connect and to unite with an absolute oneness of the Kodesh Baruch Hu, and more so, he says over here, to what level a person could climb, can ascend in that oneness with Hashem, which is in a way, again, in a way that there is nothing, not only nothing blocking, but that connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu it remains absolute, but not only absolute, but it touches and becomes one with the core of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the way that Hashem is for himself by himself. Again, as explained, the last two classes, namely the last class, and again the culminating words over here of the Alter Rebbe in this Perek, how it's reflected in our Avodas Hashem, the idea of Limud HaTorah b'simcha rabba, Limud HaTorah mit chit chibit chila b'chim with the Kodesh Baruch Hu, fear and awe of HaKadosh Baruch Hu.